Thank you for joining us here on Skilled, Safe, and Trailblazing. If you're responsible for training the next generation of lab professionals or looking to level up your own expertise, you're in the right place. My name is Jessica Martin, and I'm a lab training professional with a background in chemical education research and community empowerment. I'm here to dive with you into the real-world strategies, expert insights, and game-changing discussions that will help us develop lab professionals who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing. Why have a policy that bars researchers from working alone? It's really all about the seconds after. At a basic level, if something goes wrong, we want to make sure that another person knows and can get help. In particularly hazardous working environments, such as a laboratory, a buddy system is often used as the answer. This does not necessarily require that the buddy is knowledgeable about the experiment, the lab, or even about first aid. They just need to be able to inform someone else, hopefully someone capable of being helpful, that something has gone wrong. At a deeper level, we likely hope that our buddy would know what to do if something went wrong. But a concern that I have heard much more often in my own research, in the seconds after, what if I am the buddy and I don't know what to do? So this makes me think of two things: criticism and training. Regarding criticism, I hear a lot of discussion after any publicized laboratory safety incident about what everyone should have done differently to prevent the incident from occurring in the first place. And while this can be a helpful exercise, I find that some harmful things can come out of it as well. An example of this is captured in a quote from a story I read years ago. The quote reads, "Two postdoctoral fellows are nearby when Sanji catches fire. One runs upstairs to summon Heron. The other tries to smother the fire with his lab coat. He doesn't think to put Sanji under an emergency shower a few feet away." The news story is linked in the show notes. In 2008, Sherry Sanji was a lab technician working in Professor Heron's research lab at UCLA. She had completed her bachelor's degree, and she had also performed a particular experiment involving a pyrophoric agent only once before under supervision and direction. A pyrophoric agent is a chemical that will ignite when exposed to air. There are several types of procedures that can be used to isolate pyrophoric agents from contact with air while moving necessary quantities from one vessel to another. In this experiment, Sherry was using a syringe to remove some of the pyrophoric agent from a bottle through a septum to then transfer it from one airtight container to another airtight container. As she was removing the agent from the bottle, the plunger of the syringe popped out. The agent that was inside of the syringe sprayed out all over the place, including all over Sherry, and the agent burst into flames. This melted a sweater she was wearing, made of a synthetic material, onto her body. She suffered severe burns and would die of her injuries several weeks later. An absolutely horrific tragedy. Now, for a detailed analysis of what Sherry could have done differently to prevent this or reduce the severity of this incident, you can go to lots of different sources. I have included a link to an ACS Chemical and Engineering News article in the show notes if you would like to check that out. For the purposes of good risk assessment and planning for future experiments with pyrophoric agents, discussing these details can be useful. If we think about this in terms of the ramp approach, it would be important for the lab group to recognize the hazards that may have gone unrecognized in the incident, assess the risks of those hazards that they may not have adequately assessed previously, and manage those risks in a way that perhaps they hadn't before. However, what I would like to focus on today is not Sherry or the R, A, and M of RAMP. I would like to focus on the two postdoctoral scholars who were in the lab with Sherry and the P of RAMP. The P of RAMP stands for Prepare for Emergencies. By the way, if you are not familiar with the RAMP approach to risk assessment, I have included a link to a webpage hosted by the American Chemical Society in the show notes where you can learn more. If the reason that researchers aren't supposed to work alone is so that your buddy can do something if you become incapacitated, then these postdocs did exactly what they should have done. One of the postdocs ran out of the lab and informed the PI of the incident, hence getting help. The other postdoc tried to address the immediate situation in the best way they could think of until help arrived. And what they did wasn't unreasonable at all. Smothering is a very common way to put out a fire. Using a flame-resistant lab coat to do this was not an entirely bad choice. However, the quote I shared with you at the beginning carries a criticism for this person that I have heard repeated many times when this story is discussed with researchers or safety professionals. He doesn't think to put Sanji under an emergency shower a few feet away. Responding to an emergency, especially one as horrifying as this one, is very difficult to do. This is why first responders go through so much training and drills, so that hopefully they will do the right thing under pressure and duress. However, in the decade that I spent working in labs, I was never required to go through any training or drills that would have prepared me to respond any differently if I had been one of these postdocs. In fact, I would push it even further. That author seemed to suggest that a more appropriate action was to put Sanji under a safety shower. I've also heard this repeated by lots of great colleagues of mine. In thinking about this statement, I looked at the members of my own graduate school lab. The size differential amongst my lab members was pretty extreme. Our smallest member was under 5 feet tall, and I don't think she even broke 100 pounds. And our largest, we had 2 men who were over 6 feet tall and well built. If one of those men was on the ground, on fire, the thought of our smallest member being able to drag them, while on fire, to a safety shower only a few feet away was laughable at best. Now maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if properly motivated and correctly positioned, she could have done it. But how often does one end up dragging a body across a floor in life? And that body could either be totally unresponsive or could be thrashing about because that person is, well, on fire. It is now that I will remind you, I've never undergone any laboratory training or drills that would have even tested this hypothesis. I've also never undergone any laboratory training or drills that tested my ability to think clearly and act appropriately while under duress. This really just isn't something that is done. But should it be? Risk assessment tells us to prepare for emergencies. This typically means to know where the eye wash and safety shower are and have a fire extinguisher and spill kit handy. Maybe something more specialized depending on the hazards present. But if we are telling researchers not to work alone in case an emergency happens, is anyone really prepared to respond to the emergency when it does happen? I couldn't imagine how awful this experience was for these postdocs. I wonder about them a lot. Did this incident prompt them to demand a different type of training? Were they insistent upon never working alone after this? Did they leave science altogether because this was entirely too stressful? And why do I think about these postdocs as much as I do? Because I have been faced too often, over the last several years, with graduate students who have told me about how worried they are about an incident happening when they are the buddy. While they have been through the standard safety training at their universities, they still feel wildly unprepared to deal with one. Since this standard safety training is typically done by slide deck in the lecture hall, or now more and more through digital delivery, it shouldn't really be surprising that they feel unprepared, or end up doing the quote-unquote wrong thing when something unexpected does happen. And I have had a number of researchers share with me that the way that they tried to address an emergency happening in front of them was criticized, with no realistic explanation of how to handle it correctly next time, and no changes to the standard training that could prepare them better to respond under duress. I had the opportunity several years ago to observe a drill that was run for a fire department local to a university to practice response to lab incidents. In this particular case, the scenario set up for them was the explosion of a liquid nitrogen tank inside of a lab space. The drill started with a phone call made by a graduate student who was working in a lab down the hall who heard the explosion and was now standing in the hall outside of the lab space. The dispatcher took the information and sent the fire department. The fire department arrived in full gear and entered and searched the space looking for people. There were 3 weighted dummies placed throughout the room in which the explosion had occurred, and one of the challenges of the exercise was for them to find the 3 dummies. While I knew it was fake, my heart definitely started to race when they were preparing to leave after having only found 2 of the dummies. And I was extremely relieved when a final sweep revealed the 3rd dummy to them. EMS was also part of the drill, so the firefighters really did stabilize the dummies and take them down to the waiting ambulances. Now, after the drill, everyone involved came together and discussed everything that happened during the drill in detail, identifying what went right, what went wrong, and what could be improved. It also prompted from the first responders important questions about lab spaces and liquid nitrogen tanks that hadn't been thought of previously, despite all of the years of experience represented in the room. These were first responders, practicing how to handle realistic worst-case scenarios within their jurisdiction. It exposed unknown unknowns that meant they could prepare better for the real thing, and built their confidence to handle incidents like this effectively. It also gave them hands-on practice with the tools of their trade in a realistic scenario. That practice builds both knowledge and confidence. Now, I recognize that people working inside of labs are not first responders. However, if something unexpected happens in a lab, they are potentially the first people on the scene in the seconds after. And in most instances, are the people most knowledgeable about what is in the space and what happened leading up to the unexpected event. Given the large amount of safety equipment that is required inside of a lab, it seems that it would follow that lab members should practice using that equipment in realistic scenarios. Some best practices can help us move in that direction. For example, having lab members perform weekly eyewash activations gives them practice in locating and activating eyewash stations inside of the areas in which they perform hazardous work. Rotating responsibility for this task exposes a greater number of lab members to this practice. Of course, this doesn't capture the act of using an eyewash station under duress. So a way to level this up? I've met a few PIs who do an annual training with their lab members that includes obscuring someone's vision and then instructing them to find their closest eyewash station. I like the realism of this approach, and it can be improved with following through with next steps, such as using the eyewash station to actually flush their eyes for the full 15 minutes. That is a lot longer than people often think it is. And also informing the PI of the incident as soon as possible, filing a report with your safety office, and if the incident is not resolved with the eyewash flushing, drilling what number you would call if you need EMS services. This could be leveled up even further if safety offices and some parts of the emergency response network at your campus were willing to participate in the drills in some capacity. Another way to level up is to include more of your lab-based safety equipment in the drill. For example, in your scenario, if someone needed to use the eyewash station, then you could easily add a hazardous material spill that needs to be cleaned up with a lab spill kit. This can also be an opportunity to get a feel for how your lab members are seeing risk in the labs in which they work. You can certainly ask the lab members themselves to come up with scenarios that would be realistic in their day-to-day work. I've also seen examples where folks have used real incidents for a tabletop drill. This is where you take the details of a real incident that has happened on your campus and discuss each step together. The benefits of using a real incident on your campus include knowing that it really did happen, thinking through how response could be handled inside of your own lab, and how response is actually handled with your response network on your own campus, which can vary a great deal from site to site. For example, I have worked in a facility in which the fire department was a 2-minute drive down the street, and I've worked in a different facility in which the fire department was about a 1-hour drive away. Those logistics should be considered when designing training on how to respond to an emergency, especially for those people inside the lab who we have already said aren't considered to be first responders. I have found 2 major limitations to the tabletop drill approach. First, people are often not following through with the actions, so their bodies aren't practicing what to do. And 2, sometimes there is either defensiveness or evasiveness about how things unfolded since it was a real incident. Additionally, I have experienced the drills feeling a little pointless when they are either too disconnected from a real lab or not enough of the response network is involved to answer the questions that these drills will inevitably surface. These things limit the unknown unknowns that can be revealed. However, with iteration, practice, and trust building among the teams involved, tabletop drills can be developed into very useful tools, and they are a great way to use incident reports that your institution may already generate. Now, I'm curious to hear from you all if this line of thinking about the UCLA incident has influenced anyone in the way that they do lab training. Is anyone out there running drills? Perhaps giving their trainees the experience of dragging a body a few feet, or really using a safety shower? I'd love to hear from you all on this topic. Specifically, have you incorporated any training that involves physicality, that involves performing the actions that might be required in the seconds after, rather than just talking about it? And if you haven't, what is stopping you from doing so? Let me know by either emailing me at skilledsafeandtrailblazing@gmail.com, commenting in our LinkedIn community, linked in the show notes, or leaving a comment on this episode. Thank you for all you do to develop lab workers who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing.
Skilled, safe, and trailblazing is meant for those working in labs or training others to do so. The information shared here is a starting point, not a complete guide or legal standard. We've done our best to use reliable sources, but we make no guarantees about accuracy or completeness. Always follow local, state, and federal laws and consult legal or safety experts if you have questions.